Yeah, and so before we get started, let's just address that thumbnail, the YouTube thumbnail. I actually think you're all using Bevel fine for the most part. Do I think you could be using it more fine? Yes. Do I have some tricks that I think will help you? Certainly. Am I going to stop making thumbnails that work like this? Absolutely not. Until people's brains stop working in a way that these things jump out at you off the page on YouTube, I'm going to keep doing it. And they're going to get more and more crazy as we go. I will use whatever trick I need to get this information into your brain. We're going to be little carpenters today. We're going to do a bunch of bevels. We're going to talk about miters. Let's get to the graph. So let's start with a quick run through of what the bevel node has available for us by default. So we're changing our distance up here. This is just how much to bevel the shape either inward or outward in the opposite direction. Self-explanatory. We can change the corner type, the style here. By default, it's this round look. We can also set it to angular and get that sharp protrusion. This will become important later because I'm not too crazy about this. It can introduce some odd artifacting. I'm not crazy about that, although that'd be able to be fixed with a blur fairly easily. I also find sometimes it creates some errors even outside of that I'm not happy with. So I don't really use it that much, but it is there. And sometimes you'll find, just like in most things with substance designers, sometimes things that purposely don't look good are helpful for getting things that aren't what they're intended to be. You have some smoothing. I'll lower the distance a bit. You have some smoothing. So this just adds like a blur. You just smooth out everything. You can think of this just like a blur. You have your non-uniform blur. This is interesting. What it's doing is blurring the initial beveled version, then using that as a mask for a non-uniform blur. This is almost the same thing as the smoothing. I prefer to do this by myself outside of the node. It is an option. This will become important in point 2 of our 5 tips. Just know you do have this as an option. You can also input a custom curve. And what this does is change the slope of the bevel to whatever you'd like. So if I had a gradient like this, it would look just like it was before. We just have a black to white transition. However, we could build a curve here or levels, whatever your preferred way of manipulating the grayscale values are. And we could draw out the specific curve we want the beveled face to take. Kind of cool. If I switch to smoothing off, it's a bit more obvious. Kind of neat. Again, common theme. I would much rather just do this after the bevel. But it is here. It's something you can do. You can also change the normal intensity. This changes the intensity of the output in normal map. Once again, I would rather just build my own normal map afterwards. I can switch between whether I would like a Sobel filter or a normal filter. I just prefer to do it outside of it. But just so you know, all these options are here. That's all the stuff that the bevel does stock for the most part. So first tip right off the bat, I wouldn't be doing any of your bevels within the tile generator or before it. I like to do them afterwards. The reason for that is just because it's a bit easier to predict and control. Right now on my edge detect, I just am able to control the width of everything nice and easily. That'll matter more when we talk about the auto levels later. If you do this before, it can be a real headache. If you do something like, I'll use a pyramid, and then I'll bring the tops down by just moving my level out high in. All right, we'll punch these guys in for a sec. You can create your bevel, which is nice, looks really sharp. The only problem with doing it this way is if we have non-uniform amounts of this, like we have 10 and 10 right now. But if I change this significantly, this bevel is actually wider than this one, right? Because it doesn't know how to make sense of that. And I find that really hard to deal with. I don't like doing that. I'd rather just do it all afterwards and have everything be nice and consistent like they are here. This is non-uniform, right? It's wider than it is tall, but we have really nice consistent bevels. They're the same thickness on top and on the sides. And that's just because we're doing the edge detect afterwards, and that's one consistent width. So that one's quick, but I think it makes a lot more sense to do all of your beveling after the tile generation and not before. What we want to talk about is the fact that this works okay. We have this set to round. The issue is if we don't actually want our bricks to be this perfect square, if we want to add a bit of roundness to that edge detect, like this is a cool look. And it's especially helpful if you're trying to do like certain more low frequency detail stuff. The only issue is we introduce all this noise on the edges, which makes total sense, right? Because we're working with a rastered image, even though this is 2048 by 2048, which is one of the resolutions I like to work at. This is just not even, right? We're getting like big wide stair steps, small stair steps. They're not, they're 1 pixel difference here, 2 pixel difference here, 3 here. The bevel's not going to be able to make sense of that in a way that you would want, right? If this were like a vector graphic where this is just like an infinitely resolute curve, you could handle it better. So this doesn't look very good. We want to be able to fix this. We do have that smoothing we discussed, and even the non-uniform smoothing, right? Because the smoothing is just going to kind of indiscriminately smooth everything. And Matt, you're just looking at this with like foggy glasses. You could use a non-uniform blur. It makes it a bit better. It restricts the smoothing more to the edge, right, to the beveled face, and less to the front face and the crack, but it doesn't do a very good job of it, in my opinion. I would much rather just do this after the fact. So I don't like using the smoothing. It's a bit better, but let's figure out a way to smooth this more. We're just going to use our own non-uniform blur grayscale. So this guy's just like a blur, except we can plug in a mask and say, hey, blur here, don't blur here. Blur where it's white, don't blur where it's black. So we can just go here. And what you could do, you'll find that it's really hard to grab the cracks from that bevel, right? Because we really just want the middle. But using this histogram scanner at a level, it's hard to get. This is what we want in between, but this sucks in the edge, right? If we plug this in. And on your non-uniform blur, you'll want to put samples to full for this. And your blades to full as well. You can sort of think of this almost like a multiplier on your samples, really. So it behooves us to have kind of these maxed out for this particular use case. It's not like you always want this. And then you have a blur. And you can see it's blurring the whole texture, but it's not blurring it much, well, not at all, in these black areas. It doesn't work great. It's okay. It's all right. The only issue is that we kind of want it to be blurring there. And it's not, which creates this sort of weird artifact. It's a bit better for sure. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. And you would also want to tighten this afterwards, right? Because we're also blurring the top. So you could grab a level and just bring your level in white in a bit. And that would tighten up the top back again. So this is a bit better. Won't work in every situation, and I still don't like that we're not getting a totally uniform bevel or totally uniform smoothing in here, because again, maybe a good way to preview this is I'll put our mask and multiply it over the base color, and you'll see what I mean. We're not doing any blurring at all in this area. I want it to only not blur in the exact crack, so I don't get this awkward jump between the two. So you can kind of, it's harder to see here, but there's like a weird jump. So what you could do instead, a way of handling this, to get this crack, is to actually make a normal of this. I'm just using a Sobel filter because I like the result here. And using a curvature, so because I'm using a normal Sobel, I'll use a curvature Sobel. Plug this in, and that's pretty good, right? We're just isolating the crack. I can go to histogram scan. And because the curvature is middle gray is neither convex or concave, black is concave, white is convex, I know if I just put this to 0.51, like just one more than middle gray, and contrast the full, I'm looking at just the stuff that's under 0.5, 0.49. And I'm still grabbing a little bit of those things, so I'm just going to push it up a bit, like that. And this isn't a bad mask to run for our, I'm going to blur it a little just to smooth it out a bit, and then scan it again. This, because I just want a kind of uniformly thick line. Might blur it a bit more. Like this. something like this. And this is not a bad thing to use as that mask. So instead of using that one, this is a bit tighter. It hugs the line really, really nice. It is the case that on this brick both worked okay, but you'll find that it's not always the case, and oftentimes this is the silver bullet. I like this one a lot. I think you'll use it a lot. Okay, so for tip 3, this is something we touched on briefly in our video for the hex pattern up here. I think it's worth going on about here as a bevel specific tip because it's really, really handy. You're going to use this all the time. And that's that you see that I'm just eyeballing the distance on the bevel here. I see a lot of people doing this. The issue with this is that it's not going to keep pace with any changes that happen behind it. It's sort of like using a level instead of an auto level. So if I decide to make my cracks wider, for instance, that bevel is no longer fully closed, right? And conversely, if I make it a lot thinner, the bevel's not as, we're shrinking the way the grayscales meet. It's not as deep anymore, right? Because the value is much brighter, right? If I put the distance back out, you'll see that the cracks actually go darker and deeper because it's a blacker value there, right? That's why what you should get used to doing, for me, for this type of thing at least, it's not always the case to do this with the bevel, but when you're doing things like this, I always do it. I just get used to setting the bevel to full. Now, you're like, well, you've ruined the texture, it's all white. It's not. There's values there. It's just that the bevel has moved into each other. The distance has moved into each other so much that there's very little difference between the low point and the high point. If you put, I can barely see it on my monitor. You probably won't be able to see it on OBS. But if I put a level here, all the values are crunched up right above. Let's see how far they went. They're between 0.973 and 1, right? But that's the key. We can just use an auto level afterwards to return our full range. And now we have the full black to white, right? If I auto level this, we got 0 and 1. So this is really handy. I use this setup a lot. A bevel followed immediately by an auto level. I can go back, change the width of this at will. If I make them bigger, doesn't matter. Bevel will always stay fully closed. Really, really nice. If I make them smaller, the bevel stays uniformly deep. It doesn't get any shallower because we're always clamping that, or we're expanding that range back to 0 to 1. So this is really, really cool. I'll use it a lot. And so for our last tip for how to use bevel is to not use bevel sometimes. Not all the time. This bevel is great. It's got all sorts of cool features on it. We don't necessarily need those all the time. We could just use a distance like we did in our flood fill video. Again, you just plug this into the mask map. It's the exact same thing as your distance on the bevel. You push this in. We do the same thing with the auto level. You just put this to full, plug it in, literally no difference. So we don't have any of those fun things on the bevel node. I don't like to use them anyway. I think the one thing you're out of luck on is the angular. We don't have anything like that on distance. But it's much cheaper, right? It's like a third as expensive this time it was rendered. I've seen it be even cheaper, right? Like a tenth as expensive. And you might be saying, well, I don't see these little green numbers. What's wrong with my Substance Designer? Nothing's wrong with your Substance Designer. You just have to go up to your heads-up display here, to the little eye icon information. You can display timings. By default, Designer has this off for reasons that remain very mysterious to me. I think it makes sense for you to have this on. I'm sure the reason is because they don't want a bunch of like needless information overhead. But I think this is great because it gets you really used to what's cheap and what's expensive. And you might be saying, okay, well, why do I care that it's cheap? Because we're just rendering these out the textures. You'd be right. I don't care on something like this small with this few nodes and the beast I got in this computer. But if you're on a smaller workstation, if you're working with a bigger graph with 4K, or if you're like pants on head crazy and you're doing something in 8K and you have like a million nodes, the savings become really, really important because as these node texture sizes scale up, that node is going to become exponentially more expensive. So that's tip 4 for the bevel tutorial. Don't use bevel some of the times. So those are the 4 tips. I hope you find them helpful. I certainly do. I will put a link to this graph in the YouTube description below, so you can download it and use it as your reference, just so you can review those 4 points we talked about. Astute observers amongst you may have noticed what's going on with the lighting situation in your apartment. It changed so much. Well, that's because my aquarium was coming online. And you might say, well, okay, why did it go light, then dark, then light, then dark? What's going on? Do you have an electrical problem? No, I don't. The thing is, I'm recording these out of step. I'm not putting them in sequence every time. Sometimes I mess up when I'm speaking. I talk all the time. I'm pretty good at it, but sometimes it doesn't happen correctly and I have to put things in order. If you like the video, like the video. I'm aiming for a cadence around 2 or 3 of these a week. So if you'd like a notification for when they go up, subscribing is the best way to get a hold of that. In the comments, if you could also leave a comment about what you'd like to see next, that's been really helpful because I have a huge laundry list of this stuff. I could vamp on it forever, but I've been very surprised at the kind of frequent asks in the comment section. It's made me think about what I probably should go over next. So that's really helpful too. I hope you liked the video. Hope you found it helpful, and we'll see you guys later.